The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty general store in Fort Kearny, Nebraska, and Ethan Irving watched from the shade of his horse as a woman, in a worn traveling dress, stepped down onto the wooden platform, her face already streaked with tears. She looked nothing like the photograph she had sent him 3 months ago. The image had shown a composed young woman with clear eyes and a hint of a smile, but the person standing before him now was trembling, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as she clutched a small carpet bag to her chest. Ethan removed his hat and approached slowly, his boots making soft sounds against the dirt road. The September afternoon sun beat down on them both, and the few townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of the mail-order bride whispered among themselves. "Miss Willa Edwards?" Ethan asked gently, his voice barely above a murmur. The woman turned to him, her green eyes swimming with fresh tears, and nodded. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a choked sob emerged. Her whole body seemed to crumple inward, and before Ethan could say another word, she was crying in earnest, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she stood there in the middle of the street, surrounded by strangers in a town she had never seen before. Ethan glanced around at the watching faces and made a quick decision. Without asking permission, he gently took her carpet bag from her trembling hands and placed his other hand carefully on her elbow. "Come with me," he said softly. "Let us get you somewhere quiet." She allowed herself to be led, still crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan guided her away from the stagecoach depot and down the main street, past the saloon where rough voices spilled out into the afternoon heat, past the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil punctuated the air. He brought her to a small whitewashed church at the edge of town, its door standing open to catch whatever breeze might venture through. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled of pine and candle wax. Ethan led Willa to one of the simple wooden pews and set her bag down beside her. She collapsed onto the seat, burying her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with the force of her weeping. He stood there for a moment, uncertain, his hat still in his hands. He had never been good with crying women. His mother had died when he was young, and he had grown up on a cattle ranch with only his father and the hired hands for company. But something in him would not let him simply walk away and leave her alone in her misery. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and waited. Minutes passed. Her crying did not slow. If anything, it seemed to intensify, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, holding it out to her without a word. She took it blindly, pressing it to her face, but the gesture seemed to unleash another wave of grief. "I am sorry," she managed to gasp between sobs. "I am so sorry. I should not have come. This was a terrible mistake." "Do not apologize," Ethan said quietly. "Just breathe." But she could not seem to stop. The tears kept coming, flowing like a river that had broken through a dam. Ethan sat beside her, patient and still, occasionally handing her a fresh handkerchief when the first became too soaked to be useful. The afternoon light shifted through the small stained glass window, painting colored patterns on the floor. Outside, the sounds of Fort Kearny continued, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, the laughter of children playing in the street. Inside the church, there was only the sound of Willa's weeping and the quiet breathing of the man who sat beside her, waiting for the storm to pass. When an hour had gone by and her tears showed no sign of abating, Ethan did something he had not planned. He moved closer to her on the pew and carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wished, put his arm around her shoulders. She stiffened for just a moment, then seemed to collapse against him, burying her face in his shoulder as she cried. He held her there, one arm around her trembling form, his other hand awkwardly patting her back the way he might comfort a frightened horse. "Whatever it is," he said softly, "it will be all right." She shook her head against his shoulder, her voice muffled and broken. "Nothing will ever be all right again." Ethan did not argue with her. He simply held her and let her cry, feeling the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, and still they sat there, the cowboy and the weeping bride, two strangers bound together by an arrangement made through letters and hope. Finally, as the light began to turn golden with the approach of evening, Willa's sobs began to quiet. She pulled back from Ethan's shoulder, her face red and swollen, her eyes bloodshot. She looked down at his soaked shirt and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I have ruined your shirt. It will dry," Ethan said. He studied her face, seeing past the tears and the redness to the delicate features beneath. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 21 or 22. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights, and a hollowness to her cheeks that suggested she had not been eating well. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Willa wiped at her eyes with the soggy handkerchief. "I do not remember." "Then let us start there," Ethan said, standing and offering her his hand. "There is a boarding house just down the street. Mrs. Patterson makes a fine chicken stew." "I cannot go out there looking like this," Willa said, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Everyone will stare." "They will stare regardless," Ethan said with a small shrug. "You are new in town, and word has already spread that Ethan Irving's mail-order bride has arrived. But Mrs. Patterson is kind, and she will not pry." Willa looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since she had arrived. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a warm brown, patient and steady. There was nothing threatening about him, nothing that made her want to run, which was remarkable given how she felt about most things at that moment. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "I have done nothing but cry since I arrived." "You must think me a complete fool." "I think you are someone who has been through something terrible," Ethan said simply. "And I think you need food and rest before we talk about anything else." He helped her to her feet and picked up her carpet bag. Together they left the church and walked through the dusty streets of Fort Kearny. True to Ethan's prediction, people stared. Women whispered behind their hands and men tipped their hats but said nothing. Willa kept her eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, trying desperately not to start crying again. The boarding house was a 2-story building with a wide front porch and flower boxes in the windows. Mrs. Patterson was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She took one look at Willa's tear-stained face and immediately ushered them both inside, clucking her tongue sympathetically. "You poor dear," she said, leading them to a small private dining room off the main hall. "Traveling is so difficult, especially for young ladies. You must be exhausted." Willa could only nod, afraid that if she tried to speak, she would start crying again. Mrs. Patterson disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with 2 bowls of steaming chicken stew, thick slices of fresh bread, and a pot of strong tea. Ethan sat across from Willa at the small table and watched as she picked up her spoon with trembling hands. The first bite seemed to unlock something in her. She ate slowly at first, then with more purpose, working her way through the entire bowl while Ethan ate his own meal in silence. The food was good, hearty and warm, and for a few minutes, Willa's tears stopped entirely. When she had finished, Mrs. Patterson brought out a slice of apple pie and Willa ate that too, surprising herself with her appetite. "Thank you," she said when she had finished, her voice still rough from crying. "That was very good." "Would you like some more, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Willa shook her head. "No, thank you. I am quite full." Mrs. Patterson looked at Ethan, who gave her a slight nod. The older woman disappeared again, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Willa across the table. "Do you feel up to talking now?" Willa's eyes immediately filled with tears again, and she looked down at her empty plate. "I do not know what to say." "You could start by telling me what happened," Ethan said gently. "When we exchanged letters, you seemed eager to come to Nebraska. Your last letter said you were looking forward to a fresh start, but the woman who stepped off that stagecoach today looked like she was running from something terrible." The tears spilled over, tracking down her already raw cheeks. "I am running from something terrible," she whispered. "But it followed me here anyway. It will follow me everywhere because it is inside me." Ethan waited, saying nothing, giving her space to continue. "My family is dead," Willa said, her voice breaking on the words. "All of them. My parents, my 2 younger sisters, my baby brother. They died 6 weeks ago in a fire that destroyed our home in Pennsylvania." Ethan's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I am so sorry." "I was supposed to be there," Willa continued, the words tumbling out now in a rush. "I had gone to town to sell some preserves we had made. I was only gone for a few hours. When I came back, the house was nothing but ashes and smoke. The neighbors said it happened so fast. They tried to get everyone out, but the smoke was too thick. My father got my mother out, but when he went back for the children, the roof collapsed." She pressed her hands to her face, her whole body shaking. "I should have been there. Maybe I could have saved them. Maybe if I had been home instead of in town, things would have been different. Or maybe you would have died too," Ethan said quietly. "And your family would not have wanted that." "I have nothing left," Willa sobbed. "No family, no home. The farm was mortgaged and everything we owned was in that house. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. When I saw your advertisement in the newspaper for a mail-order bride, it seemed like the only option. A way to start over somewhere new, somewhere without memories. But I cannot escape it. I close my eyes and I see the ashes. I smell the smoke. I hear my mother screaming." She looked up at him, her green eyes wild with grief. "I am broken, Mr. Irving. I thought I could come here and be a proper wife to you, but I cannot stop crying. I cannot sleep. I cannot think about anything but what I lost. You should send me back. You deserve someone whole, not this shell of a person." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. "I am not sending you anywhere," he said firmly. "You have traveled nearly 1,000 miles to get here. The least I can do is give you time to grieve." "But we had an arrangement," Willa protested weakly. "You paid for my passage. You were expecting a wife." "I was expecting a partner," Ethan corrected. "Someone to build a life with. That does not happen overnight, and it certainly cannot happen when you are drowning in grief. We will take this one day at a time, Miss Edwards. For now, you need rest and safety. Everything else can wait." His words were so kind, so reasonable, that Willa felt a fresh wave of tears building. But these were different somehow, less sharp with desperation and more soft with relief. "I do not deserve your kindness." "Everyone deserves kindness," Ethan said, "especially someone who has lost so much." Mrs. Patterson returned then with a key in her hand. "I have prepared a room upstairs for Miss Edwards," she said. "Clean sheets, fresh water for washing, and a lock on the door. She will be quite safe here." Willa looked up at her, confused. "I thought I would be staying at Mr. Irving's ranch." "Eventually, perhaps," Ethan said. "But for now, I think it best if you have your own space, somewhere you can rest and recover without worrying about being a proper wife or meeting anyone's expectations." I will pay for your room here as long as you need it. But people will talk, Willa said. Let them talk, Ethan replied with a shrug. Fort Kearny has survived worse scandals than a mail-order bride staying at a boarding house instead of immediately moving in with her intended husband. Your reputation is safe, Miss Edwards. Mrs. Patterson is well respected, and she will act as your chaperone. Willa did not have the energy to argue. She let Mrs. Patterson lead her upstairs to a small but comfortable room with a brass bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. When the door closed behind the older woman, Willa collapsed onto the bed and cried until she fell into an exhausted sleep. She woke in the middle of the night, disoriented and gasping from a nightmare about smoke and flames. The room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the thin curtains. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her chest. Then she saw her carpet bag sitting on the chair where Mrs. Patterson had placed it, and memory returned. Nebraska, Fort Kearny, Ethan Irving. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The town was peaceful at this hour, just a few lights burning in distant windows. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after weeks of chaos and grief. Willa pressed her forehead against the cool glass and took a shaky breath. She had cried so much today that she felt hollowed out, empty of everything except a dull ache. But for the first time since the fire, she felt something else too. A tiny flicker of something that might, eventually, become hope. The next morning, Willa woke to the sound of breakfast being prepared downstairs. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up through the floorboards, making her stomach rumble despite her grief. She washed her face in the basin, wincing at how red and swollen her eyes still looked, and changed into a fresh dress from her limited wardrobe. Everything she owned fit into that single carpet bag. The reminder made her chest tighten, but she forced herself to breathe through it. Downstairs, Mrs. Patterson greeted her with a warm smile and a plate piled high with bacon, eggs, and biscuits. "You need to eat, dear. Keep your strength up." Willa sat at a small table near the window and ate mechanically, tasting nothing. She was halfway through her meal when Ethan Irving appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked freshly washed, his dark hair still damp. "Good morning, Miss Edwards," he said politely. "I hope you slept well." Willa's eyes immediately filled with tears at the kindness in his voice, but she blinked them back fiercely. "As well as could be expected, Mr. Irving. Thank you for asking. I thought, if you are feeling up to it, you might like to take a walk around town," Ethan said. "Get your bearings, see what Fort Kearny has to offer. No pressure, of course. If you would rather rest, I understand." Willa hesitated. The thought of facing the curious stares of the townspeople made her want to hide in her room, but she also knew she could not stay locked away forever. "A walk might be nice," she said quietly. They set out together through the morning streets of Fort Kearny. The town was bustling with activity now that the sun had risen. Farmers brought their wagons in from surrounding homesteads, loaded with produce and grain. Women in calico dresses haggled with merchants over the price of flour and sugar. Children chased each other through the dusty streets, their laughter bright and careless. Ethan walked beside Willa at a leisurely pace, pointing out various landmarks. "That is the general store where I buy most of my supplies. The owner, Mr. Thompson, is honest and fair in his dealings. Over there is the schoolhouse. It is new, built just last year. The teacher, Miss Hartley, came from Boston." Willa nodded, taking it all in. She tried to imagine herself as part of this community, shopping at the general store, perhaps attending church services, making friends with the other women. But the images felt distant and unreal, like something happening to someone else. They passed the blacksmith shop, where the smith was shoeing a large bay horse. The animal danced nervously, and the smith spoke to it in low, soothing tones. Willa stopped to watch, something about the scene catching her attention. The patience the man showed, the way he gentled the frightened animal with steady hands and a calm voice, reminded her of how Ethan had treated her yesterday. "That is Samuel Baker," Ethan said. "Best blacksmith in 3 counties. If you ever need anything repaired, he is your man." They continued walking, and Willa felt some of the tightness in her chest begin to ease. The normalcy of it all, the simple rhythms of daily life continuing regardless of her personal tragedy, was oddly comforting. The world had not stopped turning just because hers had fallen apart. "Would you like to see the ranch?" Ethan asked as they reached the edge of town. "It is about 3 miles out. We could take a wagon if you do not feel up to riding." Willa looked out at the vast Nebraska prairie stretching endlessly before them. The grass was still green in places, though the approaching autumn was beginning to paint it gold. The sky seemed impossibly large, unmarred by the smoke and industry she had known in Pennsylvania. Something about the openness of it called to her. "I would like that," she said. Ethan borrowed a wagon from the livery stable, and they rode out into the prairie together. The road was rough, little more than a dirt track worn by repeated use, but the wagon was sturdy and Ethan drove with practiced ease. Willa sat beside him on the bench seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape roll by. "I inherited the ranch from my father 5 years ago," Ethan explained as they drove. "He built it up from nothing, came out here in 1851 when this was all still wild territory. Worked himself nearly to death getting the cattle operation going. By the time he passed, we had 200 head and grazing rights on several thousand acres." "You run it alone?" Willa asked. "I have 2 hired hands who help with the cattle and the heavier work," Ethan said. "Charlie and Tom. Good men, both of them. They live in the bunkhouse on the property, and there is Mrs. Chen who comes 3 times a week to help with cooking and cleaning. She is a widow from California who settled here with her late husband during the gold rush years." "Mrs. Chen," Willa repeated, surprised. She had not expected to find anyone of Chinese descent this far into the Nebraska plains. "Her husband worked on the railroad before he died," Ethan explained. "She stayed because she had nowhere else to go. Some folks in town gave her trouble at first, but she proved herself to be a hard worker and a good neighbor. Now most people have accepted her." Willa heard the unspoken message in his words. If the town could accept Mrs. Chen despite her difference, perhaps they would be patient with a grief-stricken male order bride as well. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise. It was more substantial than Willa had expected. The main house was a solid wooden structure with a covered porch and real glass windows. There was a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a corral where a dozen horses milled about. Cattle dotted the surrounding grassland, peacefully grazing. "It is beautiful," Willa said, and meant it. Ethan's face brightened with pride. "My father built most of it with his own hands. I have added some improvements over the years. The house has 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and even a small library. My mother insisted on having books, and my father indulged her. After she died, he could not bring himself to part with them." They climbed down from the wagon, and Ethan showed her around the property. The barn was well organized, with stalls for the horses and storage for hay and grain. The bunkhouse where Charlie and Tom lived was simple but clean. The main house, when Ethan unlocked the door and led her inside, smelled of pine and leather. The interior was masculine but not uncomfortable. The main room held a large stone fireplace, several comfortable chairs, and shelves lined with books. The kitchen was spacious with a good iron stove and a large wooden table. Upstairs, Ethan showed her the 3 bedrooms, each simply furnished but clean. "This would be your room," Ethan said, opening the door to the largest bedroom. "It has the best light and the most space." "I would take the smaller room down the hall." Willa stepped inside and looked around. The room had a large bed with a simple quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a rocking chair by the window. The window itself looked out over the prairie, offering an unobstructed view of the endless grassland and the big sky. "It is lovely," Willa said softly. Then, without warning, tears began streaming down her face again. "I am sorry. I do not know why I cannot stop crying." Ethan guided her gently to the rocking chair and waited while she wept. He had noticed a pattern already. Anything kind, anything gentle, seemed to trigger her tears. It was as if she had been holding herself together through pure force of will for so long that any softness caused her defenses to crumble. When her sobs had quieted to sniffles, he spoke. "My mother used to say that tears were the heart's way of healing. That we had to let the grief out or it would poison us from the inside." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Willa managed. "She was," Ethan agreed. "She died when I was 12. Fever took her one winter, came on fast and took her before the doctor could even make it out from town. My father cried for 3 days straight. I had never seen him cry before, and it scared me. But afterward, he seemed lighter somehow, like the crying had let something loose that needed to get out." Willa wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. "How long before the crying stopped, for my father?" "Months," Ethan said honestly. "He would be fine for days, and then something would remind him of her and he would have to go off by himself to weep. But eventually, the time between the crying spells got longer, and eventually he could talk about her without breaking down. He never stopped missing her, but he learned to live with the missing." "I do not know if I can learn to live with this," Willa whispered. "You do not have to know right now," Ethan said. "You just have to keep breathing, keep eating, keep putting one foot in front of the other. The rest will come in time." They sat in silence for a while, Willa in the rocking chair and Ethan leaning against the doorframe. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang. "Why did you send for a mail-order bride?" Willa asked suddenly. "A man with a ranch like this, you could have your pick of women in town." Ethan considered the question. "Fort Kearny is a small town. Most of the unmarried women here are much younger, barely out of childhood. The few closer to my age are either already spoken for, or have made it clear they have no interest in ranching life. And I suppose I wanted someone who chose this life deliberately, who wanted to be here, rather than someone who simply settled because there were limited options." "I chose this life because I had no other options," Willa said bitterly. "Perhaps," Ethan acknowledged, "but you still chose. You could have stayed in Pennsylvania, could have tried to find work in a city, could have imposed on distant relatives. Instead, you took a chance on something completely unknown. That takes courage." "It does not feel like courage," Willa said. "It feels like desperation." "Sometimes they are the same thing," Ethan replied. They returned to town in the late afternoon. Ethan left Willa at the boarding house with instructions to rest, and promised to call on her again the next day. True to his word, he appeared the following morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. A pattern emerged over the next 2 weeks. Ethan would arrive after breakfast, and they would spend the day together. Sometimes they walked through town. Sometimes they rode out to the ranch. Sometimes they simply sat in the boarding house parlor and talked, or more accurately, Ethan talked while Willa cried and listened. He told her about his childhood on the ranch, about learning to rope cattle from his father, about the harsh winters and the beautiful springs. He told her about the first time he had seen a tornado touch down on the prairie, a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight. He told her about his mother's flower garden, which he had tried and failed to maintain after her death, and about his father's stubborn insistence on reading every single book in their library before he died. Willa listened and cried. She cried when Ethan told funny stories about the ranch hand's misadventures. She cried when he described the sunrise over the prairie. She cried when he brought her wildflowers he had picked on the way into town. She cried at everything and nothing, her grief an endless well that seemed to have no bottom. But Ethan never complained. He never told her to stop crying or to pull herself together. He simply handed her handkerchiefs, which he had started carrying in bulk, and waited patiently for each storm to pass. Slowly, very slowly, Willa began to talk too. She told him about her family, about her father who had been a farmer and a dreamer, always certain that next year's crop would be the one to make their fortune. She told him about her mother, who had been practical and warm, who sang while she worked and made their small farmhouse feel like a palace. She told him about her sisters, Margaret, who was 16 and serious, and Jane, who was 14 and mischievous, and her baby brother Thomas, who was only 8 and loved frogs and fishing. She told him about the day of the fire, about how she had been laughing with the storekeeper about something trivial when she saw the smoke rising in the distance, about how she had known, somehow, that it was her home burning, even before she started running, about arriving to find neighbors standing helpless in front of the inferno, about her father's soot-stained face when he stumbled out with her mother in his arms, about his screaming as he tried to go back in for the children, and the men who had to physically restrain him. She told him about the funerals, about watching 5 coffins lowered into the ground, about the terrible silence of the house she shared with her aunt afterward, the way every room echoed with absence, about how her aunt had been kind but overwhelmed, a widow herself with 3 children to feed and no room for another mouth, about the advertisement for a mail-order bride that had seemed like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. And she cried through all of it, great racking sobs that shook her whole body. But Ethan listened to every word, and when the crying got so bad that she could not speak, he would pull her into his arms and hold her, his hand rubbing slow circles on her back, his voice murmuring wordless comfort. The people of Fort Kearny watched this strange courtship with curiosity and, in some cases, concern. It was not normal for a mail-order bride to live in a boarding house instead of with her intended husband. It was not normal for a man to court a woman who could not stop crying. But Ethan Irving had always been a steady, respectable man, and Mrs. Patterson vouched for the propriety of the arrangement. So the gossip remained relatively kind. 3 weeks after Willa's arrival, on a golden October afternoon, something shifted. They were sitting on a bench outside the boarding house, watching the town go about its business. Willa had been crying as usual, but the tears had slowed to occasional tracks down her cheeks, rather than the torrential sobs of earlier weeks. A young boy ran past chasing a hoop with a stick, laughing with pure joy. Willa watched him, and for a moment a tiny smile flickered across her face. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by a fresh wave of tears, but Ethan had seen it. "You smiled," he said softly. Willa looked at him, startled. "I did, just for a second," Ethan confirmed. "When you saw that boy playing." Willa's face crumpled. "I should not smile. They are barely cold in their graves, and I am sitting here smiling at a child playing. What kind of sister am I? What kind of daughter?" "The kind who is still alive," Ethan said firmly. "Willa, your family would not want you to stop living because they are gone. They would want you to smile and laugh and find joy again." "You do not know that," Willa sobbed. "Yes, I do," Ethan said. Because I know that if I died tomorrow, I would want you to keep living. I would want you to find happiness. And I have only known you 3 weeks. How much more must your family have loved you, having known you your whole life? The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She cried harder, but there was something different about these tears. They felt less like drowning and more like release. Ethan pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and prairie wind. His arms were strong around her, steady and safe. She had come to depend on this, on his solid presence, on the way he never flinched from her grief or tried to rush her through it. "I am so tired of crying," she whispered against his shirt. "I know," Ethan murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "But it is all right. Cry as long as you need to." "What if I need to cry forever?" Willa asked. "Then I will hold you forever," Ethan said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Willa pulled back slightly to look up at his face. His brown eyes were serious, sincere. He meant it, she realized. This man who had started as a stranger, who had every right to send her back to Pennsylvania as damaged goods, who had gotten nothing but tears and grief in exchange for his kindness, he meant it. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why are you so patient with me?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "At first, because it seemed like the decent thing to do. You arrived broken and hurting, and I could not in good conscience abandon you. But now," he paused, his hand coming up to gently cup her tear-stained cheek. "Now it is because I have come to care for you, Willa Edwards. I have listened to you talk about your family, and I see the love you carry for them. I have watched you fight through grief that would crush most people, and I see your strength. I have held you while you cried, and I have come to cherish the trust you place in me to be there in your darkest moments." Fresh tears welled in Willa's eyes, but these were different, softer somehow. "I care for you too," she whispered. "You have been so kind to me, so patient." "I do not deserve it." "You deserve kindness," Ethan said, echoing the words he had spoken on that first day. "Everyone does, but especially you." They sat there on the bench as the afternoon faded into evening, Willa crying softly in Ethan's arms, but feeling for the first time since the fire that maybe, eventually, things might be all right. That night, Willa slept better than she had in weeks. She still woke from nightmares about the fire, but when she did, she found herself thinking about Ethan's steady presence, about the way he had held her, about the words he had spoken. It soothed something in her, made the darkness a little less frightening. The next morning, when Ethan arrived at the boarding house, Willa was waiting for him in the parlor. Her eyes were still red-rimmed from crying, but there was something different about her demeanor. She stood straighter, held her head a little higher. "Good morning," she said. "I was wondering if we might go to the ranch today. I would like to see it again." Ethan smiled, pleased by this show of initiative. "Of course, I will get the wagon." They drove out to the ranch in comfortable silence. The autumn colors were deepening now, the prairie grasses turning golden and amber. The air had a crisp edge that spoke of coming winter. Willa breathed it in, feeling it clear her head somewhat. At the ranch, Ethan helped her down from the wagon, and she stood looking at the house, the barn, the wide prairie stretching in all directions. "It really is beautiful here," she said. "Would you like to see the inside of the house again?" Ethan asked. Willa nodded. They went inside, and this time Willa looked around with more attention to detail. She noticed the books in the library, running her fingers along the spines. She examined the kitchen, noting where supplies were kept and how the stove worked. She went upstairs to the bedroom that Ethan had said would be hers and stood at the window, looking out at the view. "I think I would like to move here," she said quietly, "if the offer is still open." Ethan, who had followed her upstairs, looked surprised and pleased. "Of course it is." But are you certain? There is no rush. You can stay at the boarding house as long as you need. I know, Willa said, but I think it is time. I cannot hide forever, and this place, it feels peaceful somehow, like maybe I could heal here. Then we will arrange it, Ethan said. But Willa, I want you to know that there are no expectations. You will have your room and I will have mine. We will live as housemates for now until you are ready for more, if you are ever ready for more. And if you decide that you are not, that you want to go back to Pennsylvania or start over somewhere else, I will not hold you to our arrangement. Willa turned to face him, tears streaming down her face again, but she was smiling through them. You are the kindest man I have ever met, Ethan Irving. I just want you to be happy, Ethan said. Or at least, eventually happy. For now, I will settle for you being safe and cared for. They moved Willa's belongings to the ranch 2 days later. It did not take long, given that everything she owned fit in a single carpet bag. Mrs. Chen was there when they arrived, a small woman with iron gray hair and clever hands. She greeted Willa with a respectful nod and showed her around the kitchen, explaining where things were kept and how Ethan liked his meals prepared. I come Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Mrs. Chen explained in accented but clear English. I cook, clean, do laundry. You need anything other days, you ask Mr. Irving or you do yourself. I can cook, Willa said, and clean. I do not want to be a burden. Mrs. Chen studied her with sharp eyes. You cry a lot, she observed bluntly. Willa flushed, embarrassed. Yes, I am sorry. I lost my family recently. Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. I lost family too, husband, 2 sons. Railroad accident 5 years ago, cried every day for a year, then every week. Then only sometimes, crying is necessary, do not apologize. The simple acceptance in her words made Willa's eyes well up again, but she smiled through the tears. Thank you. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm. Willa woke early and made breakfast for herself and Ethan. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about the day ahead. After breakfast, Ethan would go out to work the ranch with Charlie and Tom, and Willa would occupy herself with household tasks. She cleaned rooms that were already clean, organized cupboards that were already organized, anything to keep her hands and mind busy. On the days Mrs. Chen came, the 2 women worked together and slowly, Willa learned the older woman's story. Mrs. Chen had come to America with her husband in 1850, part of the great wave of Chinese immigrants drawn by the promise of gold. They had not found gold, but her husband had found work on the railroad, dangerous and backbreaking labor that paid barely enough to survive. They had 2 sons, both born in California. Then came the accident, a bridge collapse that killed 12 men, including Mrs. Chen's entire family. Why did you stay? Willa asked one day as they worked side by side preparing a roast for dinner. If everyone you loved was gone, why not go back to China? Nothing in China for me, Mrs. Chen said with a shrug. Family, they're all dead or might as well be. At least here I can work, earn money, have little bit of respect. In China, widow with no sons is nothing. Here, I am Mrs. Chen who makes best dumplings in Nebraska and keeps house so clean you could eat off floor. Willa smiled at the woman's practical pride. Will you teach me to make dumplings? Mrs. Chen looked surprised, then pleased. You want to learn? I want to learn everything, Willa said. I want to be useful. I want to be more than just the woman who cries all the time. You are already more than that, Mrs. Chen said firmly. But yes, I teach you dumplings. Maybe Mr. Irving finally eat good Chinese food instead of asking for only beef and potatoes. The dumpling lessons began the following week. Mrs. Chen was a patient but exacting teacher, showing Willa how to mix the dough, how to roll it thin, how to fold the filling inside in perfect pleats. Willa's first attempts were clumsy and uneven, and she cried tears of frustration when they fell apart in the boiling water. "First time is always hard," Mrs. Chen said, unbothered. "Try again." So Willa tried again, and again, and again. By the end of the afternoon, her dumplings still were not perfect, but they were holding together. When Ethan came in for dinner and found a plate of steaming dumplings on the table, his face lit up with surprised delight. "You made these?" he asked Willa. "Mrs. Chen taught me," Willa said, wiping at her eyes. She had cried several times during the lesson, but they had been tears of frustration rather than grief, which felt like progress. Ethan bit into a dumpling and closed his eyes in appreciation. "These are wonderful." "They are lumpy and uneven," Willa protested. "They are delicious," Ethan corrected. "And you made them, which makes them even better." Willa felt a warm glow in her chest at his praise, a feeling she had not experienced in months. It was almost immediately followed by a wave of guilt. How could she feel pleasure when her family was dead? But she remembered what Ethan had said about how they would want her to live, to find joy again. She held onto that thought and let herself enjoy the moment. As October turned to November, Willa found herself crying less frequently. The tears still came, sometimes out of nowhere, triggered by a smell or a sound or a random memory. But the crying jags were shorter now, and there were hours, sometimes even whole days, when she did not cry at all. She began to take an interest in the ranch, asking Ethan questions about the cattle and the horses. He started bringing her along when he rode out to check on the herd, teaching her about the land and the animals. Willa proved to be a natural horsewoman, her body remembering skills from childhood rides on her father's plow horses. One crisp November morning, they were riding along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the property, when Willa suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. Ethan, riding beside her, halted as well and looked at her with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Willa was staring at the creek, her eyes distant. "My brother Thomas loved to play in the creek near our farm. He would catch tadpoles and minnows and bring them home in a bucket, begging Mother to let him keep them. She always said no, and he always looked so heartbroken until Father would take him back to release them and explain about how wild things needed to stay wild to be happy." Her eyes filled with tears, and Ethan braced himself for the sobbing that usually followed any mention of her family. But to his surprise, Willa blinked the tears back and smiled, a real genuine smile. "He was such a sweet boy," she said softly, "always so full of questions and energy. Mother used to say he was part jackrabbit the way he bounced everywhere instead of walking properly." "He sounds like he was a joy," Ethan said carefully. "He was," Willa agreed. "They all were. I miss them so much it hurts, but I am glad I had them, even if it was only for a short time. Better to have loved them and lost them than never to have known them at all." Ethan felt something tight in his chest loosen. This was a turning point, he recognized. She was moving from drowning in grief to swimming in it, learning to carry the loss instead of being crushed by it. "Would you like to tell me more about them?" he asked gently. "I would like to know them, if only through your stories." So Willa told him. As they rode slowly along the creek, she shared memories of her sisters and brother, of her parents, of the life she had lost. She cried a little, but she smiled too, and sometimes even laughed as she recounted funny moments and silly arguments and the ordinary magic of family life. Ethan listened and asked questions, storing away these stories about people he would never meet, but who had shaped the woman riding beside him. And he felt honored that she trusted him enough to share them. That night, after dinner, they sat together in the main room of the house. A fire crackled in the fireplace, warding off the November chill. Willa was attempting to mend one of Ethan's shirts, something she was not very good at but was determined to learn. Ethan sat in his chair with a book, but he was not really reading. He kept glancing over at Willa, watching the firelight play across her face. She had changed since that first day at the stagecoach depot. The hollowness had left her cheeks as Mrs. Chen's cooking and her own returning appetite filled her out. The dark circles under her eyes had faded with better sleep. She still looked sad, probably would for a long time, but there was life in her face now, animation where before there had been only blank despair. "You are staring," Willa said without looking up from her stitching. "I am admiring," Ethan corrected. "There is a difference." Willa did look up then, her cheeks flushing pink. "Admiring what, you?" Ethan said simply. "Your strength, your resilience, the way you keep fighting even when it would be easier to give up." Willa set down her sewing, tears welling in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I think I am only strong because you give me space to be weak. You let me cry and fall apart, so when I am done falling apart, I can put myself back together again." "You give me too much credit," Ethan said. "You are doing the hard work of healing. I am just here to hold your hand while you do it." Willa stood and crossed the room to where he sat. She looked down at him, her green eyes serious. "May I try something?" "Of course," Ethan said, setting his book aside. Willa leaned down and kissed him, a soft, tentative press of her lips against his. It was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent electricity racing through both of them. When she pulled back, her face was bright red and tears were streaming down her cheeks. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "That was too forward of me. I should not have presumed." Ethan stood and gently took her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "You have nothing to apologize for. I have wanted to kiss you for weeks, but was afraid to push you before you were ready." "I do not know if I am ready," Willa admitted, "but I wanted to try. I wanted to feel something other than grief for a moment." "And did you?" Ethan asked softly. "Feel something other than grief?" Willa nodded, fresh tears falling. "Yes, I felt happy. And then I felt guilty for feeling happy. And then I felt confused about feeling guilty. And now I am crying again, which I do not even want to be doing." Ethan pulled her into his arms and she clung to him, crying into his shoulder. "It is all right to feel happy," he murmured against her hair. "It is all right to want to live again. Your family would want that for you." "I know," Willa sobbed. "I know that in my head, but my heart is having a harder time believing it." "Then we will keep working on it," Ethan said, "for as long as it takes." They stood there in the firelight, holding each other until Willa's tears subsided. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at Ethan with a watery smile. "Would you kiss me again? Properly this time?" Ethan smiled and lowered his head, capturing her lips in a slow, sweet kiss. This time Willa did not pull away. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "That was nice," Willa said, then laughed at how inadequate the word was. "Better than nice. Wonderful." "Yes," Ethan agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "It was." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, until the fire burned down to embers and the November wind rattled the windows. And for the first time since she had lost her family, Willa felt something like hope taking root in her heart. The winter came on hard and fast that year. By December, snow lay thick on the ground and the prairie wind howled around the ranch house. Willa had worried that being snowed in would make her depression worse, but to her surprise, she found comfort in the enforced closeness with Ethan. They spent the long winter evenings together, talking and reading and playing checkers by the fire. Ethan taught Willa to play chess, and she proved to be a quick study, beating him within a month of learning the rules. They cooked together, combining Ethan's simple ranch fare with the recipes Mrs. Chen had taught Willa and the dishes Willa remembered from her mother's kitchen. and they talked. Endless conversations about everything and nothing. Ethan told her his dreams for the ranch, his plans to expand the herd and perhaps start raising horses as well as cattle. Willa talked about her childhood, the good memories beginning to outnumber the painful ones. They discussed books they had read, places they hoped to someday visit, the small, everyday details of building a life together. Willa still cried, but less frequently now. Sometimes a week would pass without tears. She still had nightmares about the fire, but Ethan was always there to hold her when she woke gasping in the dark, to soothe her back to sleep with gentle words and a steady presence. On Christmas Eve, Ethan presented her with a gift, a beautifully bound journal with blank pages. "I thought you might want to write down your memories," he explained, "of your family, so you never forget them." Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she hugged him tight. "Thank you. This is perfect." She started writing that very night, sitting by the fire while Ethan dozed in his chair. She wrote about her parents, about her siblings, about the farm and the life they had shared. The words flowed easily, and though tears fell onto the pages, smudging the ink in places, it felt good to get the memories out of her head and onto paper where they could be preserved. On Christmas morning, Willa woke early and made a special breakfast, pancakes and bacon and the precious eggs that the ranch hens still occasionally produced, even in winter. When Ethan came downstairs, she greeted him with a kiss that made his eyes widen in surprise and pleasure. "Merry Christmas," she said, smiling. "Merry Christmas," he replied. "What has you in such good spirits?" "I woke up and realized that I am happy," Willa said simply. "Not all the time, and I still miss my family terribly, but right here, right now with you, I am happy. And I wanted to tell you, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" Ethan asked, pulling her close. "For being patient with me, for not giving up when I could not stop crying, for holding me through the worst of it until I could find my way back to myself." She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and bright. "I love you, Ethan Irving. I do not know when it happened, whether it was the first day when you held me in the church or gradually over these months of getting to know you, but I love you, and I wanted you to know." Ethan's face split into a wide grin, and he picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh and clutch at his shoulders. "I love you too, Willa Edwards. I have loved you for months, but I was afraid to say it, afraid it would be too much pressure when you were still grieving." "I will probably always be grieving in some way," Willa said as he set her back down. "But I have learned that I can grieve and still live. I can miss them and still build a future. They will always be part of me, but they do not have to be all of me." They kissed then, a long, deep kiss that warmed them both more than the fire crackling in the hearth. When they broke apart, Ethan took both her hands in his. "Willa Edwards, will you marry me?" "Not because of some arrangement made through letters, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you." Willa's eyes filled with happy tears. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were wed in the small whitewashed church in Fort Kearny on a bright January day. The same church where Ethan had first held her while she cried, now decorated with winter greenery and filled with townspeople who had come to witness their union. Willa wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Ethan wore his best suit, his dark hair slicked back and his face shining with joy. Willa cried during the ceremony, but they were tears of happiness mixed with bittersweet sorrow for the family who could not be there to see her wed. When the minister asked if she took Ethan to be her lawfully wedded husband, she answered in a clear voice, "I do," and meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, in the bedroom that had been hers alone but was now theirs to share, Ethan held her gently as she cried one more time. "I wish they could have met you," she whispered against his chest. My family, they would have loved you." "I wish I could have met them too," Ethan said, stroking her hair. "But they live on in you, in your memories and your stories. And I promise, Willa, I will help you keep their memory alive. We will tell our children about them, about grandmother and grandfather Edwards, about Aunt Margaret and Aunt Jane and Uncle Thomas. They will not be forgotten." The mention of future children made Willa smile through her tears. "Our children," she said wonderingly. I had not let myself think that far ahead. "We do not have to rush," Ethan assured her. "We have all the time in the world." But as it turned out, time moved faster than expected. By March, Willa knew she was pregnant. She told Ethan on a warm spring evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and pink. "I am going to have a baby," she said quietly. Ethan turned to her, his eyes wide. "Truly?" Willa nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "I am happy about it. But I am also terrified. What if I am not a good mother? What if something happens? What if I lose this baby like I lost everything else?" Ethan pulled her into his arms. "You are going to be a wonderful mother, and we will do everything we can to keep you and the baby safe and healthy. Mrs. Chen has delivered babies before, and we will get the doctor from town to check on you regularly. You are not alone in this, Willa. We will face it together." The pregnancy was not easy. Willa suffered terrible morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon. She was exhausted and emotional, crying at the smallest things. But Ethan was endlessly patient, holding her hair back when she was sick, bringing her cool water and dry crackers, rubbing her swollen feet at the end of long days. Mrs. Cheng clucked over her like a mother hen, making special soups and teas that were supposed to help with the nausea. She told Willa stories about her own pregnancies, the joys and challenges, and Willa found comfort in the older woman's matter-of-fact wisdom. As summer approached and Willa's belly grew round, she began to feel the baby move inside her. The first flutter of movement made her cry with wonder and joy. She grabbed Ethan's hand and placed it on her stomach, waiting for him to feel it too. When he did, his face lit up with such pure happiness that Willa fell in love with him all over again. "Hello, little one," Ethan whispered to her belly. "We cannot wait to meet you." Willa started sewing baby clothes with Mrs. Chen's help, tiny gowns and blankets and caps. As she worked, she told the baby stories about the family it would never meet, about the grandparents and aunts and uncle who would have adored this child. And though tears often fell as she spoke, they were gentle tears, soft with remembrance rather than sharp with fresh grief. The baby came in late November, almost exactly a year after Willa had agreed to marry Ethan. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Willa was certain she could not do it, that she was going to die and leave Ethan alone just as her family had left her alone. But Mrs. Chen was there, steady and competent, and Ethan held her hand and talked her through each contraction. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You are the strongest person I know, just a little longer." And finally, after hours of pain and pushing, the baby arrived with a lusty cry that filled the room. Mrs. Chen wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed it in Willa's arms. "A boy," she announced with a smile. "Healthy and strong." Willa looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, naming him after her lost brother. "Welcome to the world." Ethan, who had tears streaming down his own face, leaned over to kiss first Willa's forehead and then the baby's. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you both so much." That night, as Willa lay in bed with baby Thomas sleeping in the cradle beside her and Ethan dozing in a chair nearby, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year and a half ago, she had been a broken woman who could not stop crying, who had seen no future beyond her grief. And here she was now, a wife and mother, building a new life on the Nebraska prairie. She still missed her family. She suspected she always would. But the missing had changed shape, had become something she could carry alongside joy instead of something that drowned out all other feeling. She thought about what Ethan's father had said, about learning to live with the missing, and understood now what he had meant. The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. Willa cried frequently, sometimes from exhaustion, sometimes from worry, sometimes from the sheer overwhelming love she felt for this small person who depended on her entirely. But Ethan was there through all of it, walking the floor with Thomas when Willa needed to sleep, changing diapers and making silly faces to coax out the baby's first smiles. Mrs. Chen visited even more frequently, bringing food and wisdom, and the occasional stern reminder that Willa needed to rest and eat to keep up her strength. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, sitting up and babbling nonsense syllables, Willa realized that she had gone a full week without crying once. The realization made her pause in the middle of mashing vegetables for the baby's dinner. A week without tears. It seemed impossible, and yet it was true. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and she and Ethan were sitting together on the porch in the warm June air, she shared her observation. "I did not cry at all this week," she said. "I just realized it." Ethan took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "How does that feel?" "Strange," Willa admitted. "For so long, crying was just what I did, part of who I was, the mail-order bride who could not stop crying. And now I seem to have stopped, at least mostly, and I do not quite know what to make of it." "It means you are healing," Ethan said gently. "It does not mean you have forgotten them or stopped loving them. It just means you have learned to carry the grief instead of being crushed by it." "When did you get so wise?" Willa asked with a smile. "I learned from you," Ethan said. "You taught me about resilience, about the human capacity to survive even the worst losses and find joy again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the prairie. Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, and Willa smiled. "I want to have more children," she said. "I want to fill this house with life and laughter. I want to build a family." "Then that is what we will do," Ethan agreed, and they did. Over the next years, 3 more children joined them. A daughter they named Margaret after Willa's lost sister. Another son they called James after Ethan's father. And finally, another daughter, Jane, completing the circle of names from Willa's first family. The ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management. They expanded the herd and built a second barn. Charlie and Tom both married local girls and built houses on the property, raising their own families while continuing to work the ranch. Mrs. Chen stayed on, helping with the endless work of keeping house and caring for 4 rambunctious children. Willa threw herself into motherhood with fierce dedication. She was determined that her children would know they were loved, that they would grow up with the same warmth and security she had known before the fire. She told them stories about the family they had never met, keeping the memories alive through words, and the journal she continued to fill with anecdotes and recollections. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, Willa would take time to herself to grieve. She would go to the small cemetery in Fort Kearny, where she had placed a memorial stone for her lost family, and she would sit there and cry and talk to them about her life, about the children they would have loved, about how much she missed them. Ethan would come find her when she had been gone long enough, and he would sit with her in silence, his presence a comfort. "Thank you," she would always say as they walked back to the wagon together, "for understanding, for giving me space to remember them." "They are part of you," Ethan would reply, "which means they are part of our family. There is always space for them here." The children grew. Thomas became a serious boy who loved books and helping his father with the ranch accounts. Margaret was bold and adventurous, more interested in horses than dolls. James was gentle and kind, always the first to comfort a sibling who was hurt or upset. And Jane was clever and mischievous, keeping everyone on their toes with her schemes and questions. Willa looked at them sometimes and felt her heart might burst with love. These beautiful children, this life she had built from the ashes of tragedy, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible during those dark days when she could not stop crying. One evening, when Thomas was 10 and Jane was 3, the whole family gathered on the porch to watch a spectacular sunset. The sky was ablaze with orange and pink and gold, the prairie grass rippling in waves beneath the wind. Willa sat in her rocking chair with Jane on her lap, Ethan beside her with his hand on her shoulder, the other children scattered around them. "Tell us about Grandmother and Grandfather Edwards," Margaret requested. It was a familiar request. The children loved hearing stories about the family they had never met, so Willa told them, her voice steady and warm. She talked about her father's terrible jokes and her mother's beautiful singing voice. She described her sister's personalities and her brother's love of frogs. The children listened, rapt as they always were, when the story was done and the sun had set, turning the sky purple and then black. Ethan sent the children inside to get ready for bed. He and Willa stayed on the porch, rocking gently in their chairs. "You know what I realized today?" Willa said softly. "What is that?" Ethan asked. "I smiled before I cried," Willa said. "When I was thinking about my mother earlier, I smiled first, remembering something funny she used to say. The crying came after, but the smile came first. That has never happened before. Usually the crying comes immediately." Ethan reached over and took her hand. "That is because you have healed, my love. The grief will always be there, but it is no longer the dominant thing. Joy has made room for itself alongside the sorrow." "Yes," Willa agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "I think you are right." She thought back to that first day in Fort Kearny, stepping off the stagecoach unable to stop crying, certain that her life was over. And she thought about the patient cowboy who had held her through all those tears, who had never rushed her or made her feel foolish for her grief, who had simply been there, steady and kind, until she finally found her way back to the light. "I love you," she said, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for waiting until I could smile again." "I would have waited forever," Ethan said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "But I am glad I did not have to. I am glad you are here, glad we built this life together." They sat there as the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie night settled around them, two people who had found each other in grief and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Inside the house, their children slept safe and warm. Around them, the land they had worked so hard to nurture stretched out in all directions, full of promise and possibility. Willa closed her eyes and breathed in the cool night air, feeling peace settle over her like a blanket. The crying was done, at least for now. In its place was something stronger, something that could hold both sorrow and joy, loss and love, memory and hope. She had survived. More than that, she had learned to live again. And sitting there on the porch with Ethan's hand in hers and her children sleeping nearby, Willa knew with absolute certainty that her family, the one she had lost and the one she had found, would all be proud of the life she had built. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the usual mixture of joys and sorrows that make up a life. There were good harvests and bad winters, illnesses that scared them and recoveries that brought relief. The children grew into young adults with dreams and ambitions of their own. Thomas, true to his bookish nature, went to study law in Omaha, though he promised to return and help manage the ranch. Margaret shocked everyone by announcing her intention to become a doctor, a highly unusual ambition for a woman in the 1880s, but Willa and Ethan supported her dream. James stayed close to home, loving ranch life as much as his father did. And Jane, bright and curious, became a teacher in the Fort Kearny schoolhouse. Through it all, Willa and Ethan remained devoted to each other. Their love had been forged in the crucible of grief and had only grown stronger with time. They still sat on the porch most evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, talking about their day or sitting in comfortable silence. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Willa with a trip back to Pennsylvania. It was the first time she had returned since leaving to become a mail-order bride. They visited the small cemetery where her family was buried, and Willa stood before the 5 headstones with tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears than the ones she had cried 20 years ago. These tears held love and remembrance rather than raw agony. She told her family about her life, about Ethan and the children, about the ranch in Nebraska and the community they had built. She told them about the memorial stone in Fort Kearny, where she went every year to remember them. She told them she loved them and missed them, and that they would always be part of her story. Ethan stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, a steady presence just as he had been from the very beginning. When she was ready, they left the cemetery together and visited the site where the farmhouse had stood. Someone else owned the land now, and a new house had been built, but Willa could still see in her mind's eye where everything had been. "It is strange," she said to Ethan as they walked around the property. "This place held so much pain for me, but it also held so much love. Both things are true at the same time." "That is life, I think," Ethan said. "Joy and sorrow, love and loss, all tangled up together. The trick is learning to hold all of it without letting any one thing overwhelm the rest." They returned to Nebraska after a week, eager to get back to their children and grandchildren. Yes, grandchildren. Thomas had married and made them proud grandparents to a baby girl. The circle of life continuing, bringing new joy even as the old griefs remained. By the time Willa reached her 60th birthday, her hair had gone silver and her hands were worn from years of hard work. But her eyes were still bright, and her smile came easily. She had become a beloved figure in Fort Kearny, known for her kindness and wisdom, for the way she welcomed newcomers to town and helped those who were struggling. People came to her sometimes, especially women who had experienced loss, and she would sit with them and listen as they cried. She would share her own story, not to minimize their pain but to give them hope that they too could survive, could learn to live again. And more than once, she told them about the patient cowboy who had held her until she finally smiled again. Ethan, now in his 60s with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, still looked at Willa like she was the most precious thing in the world. Their children teased them sometimes about how affectionate they still were with each other. But it was teasing born of love and the security of knowing their parents' marriage was solid as a rock. One autumn evening, very much like that first evening when Willa had arrived in Fort Kearny so many years ago, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. The prairie was painted gold with the setting sun, and the air had that crisp quality that spoke of coming winter. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Answering my advertisement, coming all this way to marry a stranger," Willa looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "I sometimes think about that day at the stagecoach depot," Ethan said. "You were so broken, so lost." I worried I had made a terrible mistake, bringing you here when you were in no state to start a new life. I worried I was being selfish, keeping you here instead of sending you home. Willa reached over and took his weathered hand in hers. You saved my life, Ethan Irving. I was drowning in grief and you threw me a lifeline. You gave me time and space to heal. You loved me when I was at my most unlovable. You showed me that it was possible to build a new life even after losing everything. How could I ever regret that? I just wanted to make sure, Ethan said softly. Because you made my life complete, Willa. Before you came, I had the ranch and I had work, but I was lonely. You brought love and laughter and life to this place. You gave me a family. You taught me what it means to truly love someone, to stand beside them through the worst and the best and everything in between. They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Around them, the ranch bustled with activity. Grandchildren played in the yard. James was checking on the horses in the barn. Margaret had come home for a visit and was in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, who was now quite elderly but still insisted on helping prepare family meals. Tell me again, Ethan said, a request he made sometimes. Tell me about the day you stopped crying. Willa smiled, remembering. It was not one day exactly, it was gradual, but I remember the first time I realized a whole week had passed without tears. And I remember the first time I smiled before I cried when thinking about my family. And I remember the day Thomas was born when I cried from joy instead of sorrow. Each of those moments was a step toward healing. And what about now? Ethan asked. How often do you cry now? Sometimes, Willa admitted. When I visit the memorial stone, when I tell stories about my family to the grandchildren, when I think about all the moments they missed, all the joys they never got to see, but the tears are different now. They are not the drowning tears of that first year. They are gentle tears, tears of remembrance and love. They come and they go, and I let them, because they are part of honoring what I lost. You are the strongest person I know, Ethan said, echoing words he had spoken many times over the years. I am strong because you made space for me to be weak, Willa replied, echoing her own often repeated truth. You held me through the weakness until I could find my strength again. As full darkness fell and the stars began to emerge in the vast Nebraska sky, they went inside to join their family for dinner. The table was crowded and noisy, full of conversation and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of multiple generations gathered together. Willa looked around at all these beloved faces, at the life she had built from ashes and tears, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. She caught Ethan's eye across the table, and he smiled at her, that special smile reserved just for her. And she smiled back, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and warmed her whole face. There were no tears, just joy and love and the deep contentment of a life well lived. After dinner, as was their custom, Willa brought out the journal Ethan had given her all those years ago. It was nearly full now, page after page of memories and stories about the family she had lost. She read a story about her mother teaching her to bake bread, and the grandchildren listened with rapt attention. When the story was done, little Thomas's daughter, also named Willa in her honor, climbed into her lap. Great-grandmother Willa, the child said in her piping voice, are you sad when you talk about them? Willa considered the question carefully. A little bit sad, yes. Because I miss them and I wish they could be here with us. But also happy, because I had them for as long as I did, and because remembering them keeps them alive in my heart. That makes sense, the little girl said seriously. Then she wrapped her small arms around Willa's neck and hugged her tight. I love you, great-grandmother. I love you too, sweetheart, Willa said, her voice thick with emotion. but when she looked up and met Ethan's eyes, she was smiling. That night, lying in bed beside her husband of more than 40 years, Willa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled from Pennsylvania to Nebraska as a broken woman who could not stop crying, had been met by a patient cowboy who had shown her what true love looked like, had built a life and a family that honored both her past and her future. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Ethan murmured sleepily, pulling her closer. "For everything," Willa said. "For being patient, for being kind, for loving me through the worst of it, for holding me until I could smile again." Ethan kissed her forehead gently. "It was my privilege and my joy. I love you, Willa Irving." "I love you too," Willa replied. And as she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mail-order bride who could not stop crying had finally found her happy ending, not because the grief had disappeared, but because she had learned to carry it alongside joy. And the patient cowboy who had held her through it all had found his happy ending too, in the love of a woman who had taught him that true strength sometimes looks like vulnerability, and that the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to fall apart and put themselves back together again. Together, they had built something beautiful from tragedy. Together, they had created a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Together, they had proven that love, real love, is patient and kind and willing to wait through endless tears for that first precious smile. And on the Nebraska prairie, under the vast starlit sky, their story became part of the land itself, a testament to resilience and hope and the healing power of love.